everyone. So I am Tara Velker. I am not Bryce Johnson. So a lot of these slides in this deck are just straight ripped off from Bryce Johnson, including the original title slide, because it doesn't fully make sense for me to be the one telling you about the full story of the adaptive controller. The adaptive controller really starts in 2015, and I didn't start working at Xbox until 2018, so I obviously missed a chunk, which is why Bryce Johnson, who was the lead designer on this project, normally is the one that tells the story. But he wasn't here, so you guys are stuck with me today. So who am I? I work at Xbox as a program manager. Specifically, I am part of Mixer, our live streaming service. I'm also the accessibility champ for Mixer and an on-air host. So if you watched Xbox E3 coverage, you probably saw me making an ass out of myself because I'm really bad at reading a teleprompter. But I'm also the Gaming for Everyone Gaming and Disability Community Lead as part of our Gaming for Everyone program, which is why I'm here talking to you guys today. And then I'm also the co-director of GAConf, which is the Game Accessibility Conference. It's the only conference in the world dedicated exclusively to game accessibility. And lucky for you guys, our next one will actually be here in the UK in London in late October. So if you guys are interested in a full day of accessibility talks, I'll look out for that. But before I was here, I worked at PlayStation Cloud Services. I was in game dev for years and years. And then, I worked for the IGGA, Able Gamers. So I've been around the block. I know what I'm talking about, mostly. So I really want to start with the adaptive controller, because I don't think a lot of people fully know what it is. And I actually have one that my colleague here, Ian Hamilton, will be passing around the room in case you haven't got to have a good look at one in person. So what is happening here? So it's basically a typical controller. It's just laid out different. So if you're looking up on the screen, you will see that we have all these jacks across the front. And all of these jacks are actually labeled in a way that maps to a standard controller, A, B, X, Y. This is where you can plug stuff in to get those jacks. It also comes with 2 USB ports, one on each side, so you can plug in you can plug in all sorts of things into there, honestly. But what you see a lot is joysticks that are used, a D-pad, and then all of the other standard buttons that you see on an Xbox controller, the Xbox button, or as I still call it, the guide blade, because I started developing games on the 360. And it really is just a controller. The biggest difference is obviously the 2 large buttons on the top. As we were working with gamers with disabilities, we found that one of the most frequent things they did was wanting to hook 2 large switches up to a controller, so we just went ahead and slapped those on there. But of course, the Xbox controller, the Xbox adaptive controller really needs the support of all of his friends to achieve everything he really can. And you guys have probably seen this picture from our marketing promotion that kind of shows everything within the family. We have smaller switches, large joysticks it works with. You can plug puff and sip controllers into it, which is this large thing on the right that's actually a mouth controller. Sensors, everything. And basically, through the use of the Xbox adaptive controller, you can take any of this other assistive technology that people were using already with their computer or other devices and use them on the Xbox. And that was really what it was about. This is another slide that I stole from Bryce, where he would always show this one and say, okay, I'm mostly done being self-indulgent, but I want to show you this one. So, why did we make this controller? So to read this tweet we have here today we rewatched, and reflected upon this Microsoft commercial with first grade. Some of their thoughts. Some kids cannot change. It doesn't mean they can't play. Microsoft did not want the kids to change, so they changed the remote. That's it. That's why we made this. We wanted everyone to be able to play, and we can't ask people to change. It's really easy to change a piece of plastic. And really, gaming is so much. And one of the things that you'll even see here is all of these gamers are playing in different ways. They have different needs, but using the Xbox adaptive controller, they're able to customize it. And that's why it's the adaptive controller. You're able to use this controller and adapt it to your needs and your situation. And really, the story of the Xbox adaptive controller actually starts with the Microsoft approach of inclusive design. We're really lucky at Microsoft to have a mission of empowering everyone to do more or everything, or some other like really inspirational quote that I jacked up right now. Point is, we want people to be able to do what they want to do. And this starts, and where the story of the adaptive controller actually starts is about recognizing exclusion. So really there are 3 parts to inclusive design, and you guys can get all of this information about the inclusive design process, cards, everything from going to the website listed. But it's about recognizing exclusion, seeing when people can't engage, learning from diversity, and that's just a classic example of if you were developing something for yourself, for people like you, and you don't talk to people who are different, you're gonna miss out. There was a great example that came up in a talk Wednesday where they mentioned, everyone's heard of the facial recognition software that only seemed to work with very light skin tones, and darker skin tones didn't work. And it was because the only people they'd ever tested it with had light skin tones. So that's an example of when learning from diversity would have helped the product. Kind of same thing. And then this idea of solving to one and extending to many. So it seems counterintuitive, but by solving for one specific person and their specific needs, you can then take that and extend that to a larger group. Now, when I first heard that last one specifically, I kind of thought it was counterintuitive. I didn't understand how would solving for one person make something better for everyone else. Like that seems like it could be, kind of a waste of time and energy, and I didn't get it. Something else I just ripped off from Bryce, the story of the average pilot. This is what helped me understand. So back in the early 1950s, the US military was developing a new airplane, and for their cockpit, what they did was they took 4,000 of their pilots and they measured them in 10 different areas, like their arm length, height, leg length, weight, all of that kind of stuff, and then took the average of each of those measurements, and then when they went to build a cockpit, built it around the average of all 4,000 pilots that they had measured. After the pilots started flying, there was a higher than expected rate of crashing outside of combat than had been anticipated. And the pilots were like, this is totally your fault, this plane is terrible. And the mechanical engineers were like, no, this plane is great, you pilots suck. So what they ended up doing then was there was this man who was just like, I have to figure out what's going out here. And he went on search for the average pilot. Of all of the 4,000 pilots that they had measured, they actually didn't have one single pilot who fell in the average range for all 10 measurements. So by designing for everyone, they had in fact designed a cockpit for no one. And so what they ended up doing in future planes to solve for that is the things that we now take for granted, even in our cars, like adjustable seats, adjustable steering wheels. So for solving for someone who was too short in the plane and being able to move it forward, they actually solved for a whole bunch of other people. So it's that same kind of concept. And when you start thinking about that as the beginning of our process on the adaptive controller, the start of our journey, remember it starts with recognizing exclusion. And the Xbox controller is a pretty great controller. Although it can be a little big for my hands, I actually really, really like it. And as Bryce would say right about now, he thinks we make the best controllers. But we make a lot of assumptions about this controller and how it's going to be used. And it's going to exclude people. Like right from the beginning, we assume that the user is going to have 2 hands to operate it and have 2 thumbs for the stick. Like right there, we've already made that assumption. And then going on, we're going to assume that people also have the fine motor control needed to hit all of these buttons, and frequently in games, hitting all of these buttons simultaneously. And then even from there, we're going to assume that people have enough dexterity in their hands to reach around and use the bumpers and triggers. And the triggers themselves are actually the hardest buttons to use on the Xbox. They require both the largest range of motion and the most strength needed to be able to press the buttons down. But how often are those the most important buttons in games? They're going to be aim and shoot, gas and brake. But they're literally on the hardest buttons to use in the controller. And then we're also assuming that someone can actually hold this controller for an extended period of time. And there's a lot of people who aren't going to be able to do that. So when you start to recognize exclusion, starting with the standard Xbox controller, you see how many people could be excluded. So now that we've recognized inclusion or exclusion, obviously the next part is learning from diversity. If we've seen that we've made all of these assumptions and their assumptions are incorrect, we obviously need to talk to other people and learn. And as actually part of the process of making the Xbox Adaptive Controller, we were able to learn from a lot of different people. We worked with organizations both in the US and the UK, so Special Effect, here in the UK, but also in the US, which is where we're based. We were able to work with Able Gamers, Warfighter Engaged, the Cerebral Palsy Foundation, and the Craig Hospital in the US. And this was really, really important in our process because there's a saying in the disability community, nothing about us without us. It's very, very common that you'll see very well-intentioned people do something or make something for a community of disabled people without ever actually checking in with them to see if they want and or need it, and this well-intentioned thing ends up being useless. So this was a really important part. So now that we've recognized there's exclusion, we started learning from diversity, what did we actually do? We needed to actually solve the final step. And for the final step here is what's known as 1 week. So 1 week is a week-long hackathon that Microsoft does every year where you're able to go and build whatever you want. And the team, back in 2015, decided they were going to work with some members of Warfighter Engaged. So they started by meeting Sergeant Josh Price, who is featured here in the video playing with this custom setup, and Ken Jones, who leads Warfighter Engaged. And the team met with them back in the 2015 hackathon, and they showed how Josh played and the setup that he needed to be able to game. And this was really powerful because it takes a lot of work, as you can see, to get this set up, and it's incredibly custom. And for this was really powerful for the leadership in the Xbox hardware team, some of them who are veterans themselves, so they understood how both this was empowering Josh and what he could be missing out on if he weren't able to game. And that really changed how the hardware team was looking at controllers. And at 2015, it didn't stop. That was just the first, kind of prototype that they made. It ended up being like a crazy thing where, basically stuff was coming out of the bottom controller. It was not the sleek, sexy product that you see today. So we had a way to go. So the next year, the 2016 hackathon, it was actually great because the Xbox hardware team assigned 3 interns to further develop the prototype that had just been worked on by a group of volunteers the year before. And while that was happening, members of the team, such as Bryce, started to create a community roadmap engagement plan, for what could happen if this were to become a real product that would eventually launch. And it was really great to be able to see younger members of the community who were just able to come in as developers and work on a really fun project like this. This is, right here, Rachel, one of the interns who was on the project, and this is just a little bit of footage from them working on that day, which is, again, really exciting. So, obviously, like I mentioned before, we were already knowing that we were going to be working with outside groups for this, and we worked with several different organizations. Now, the first one, you guys likely know, was Special Effect, and they were actually brought in really early on to the prototyping phase, but we learned a lot from them even before we started talking to them directly. So they do a wonderful job of posting photos and videos of their work online. And so we were able to just literally see what are they building, who are they building it for, how is it being used, before we ever actually had to talk to them. So we got a lot of information from their social media. And honestly, one of the great things about us partnering with all of these groups is that although they had the same goal of helping people with disabilities be able to game and solve their custom control issues, they all had different methods. So special effect, they will come to your house and they will create a device for you and loan you the equipment. And the reason they loan you the equipment is over time your needs may change. And so since it's a loaner item, they can come back and give you a completely new setup when your needs changed and just take away the stuff you don't need anymore. And so as you change, they can adapt your setup for you, which is a different approach than, like, say, Able Gamers in the US that does a grant system. And so their solutions are different, but they have the same goal. And like I said, the other charity that we worked with a lot was Able Gamers. And so in the summer of 2016, we started to reach out to these other nonprofits. And Able Gamers was extremely, extremely helpful when beta testing the device. So normally when we start testing hardware within Xbox, we do it completely internally. If there's a new type of controller, if there's a new type of console, it's all tested by our staff. But we were not the target audience, and we were not going to find enough people to fully give a proper beta test internally, and so we had to work with external groups to get this beta device in the hands of users to get their feedback. And what was really great was Able Gamers has a system called player panels. Well, they basically helped us find participants to do take-home beta testing for this device. And then finally, another one we worked with was Craig Hospital. And the Craig Hospital relationship was actually really great and really unique. So it's kind of a combination of assistive tech, OT, and everything else. So initially when the partnership program started, we were working with an OT whose information I have at the end of the slide named Erin, and she kind of had reservations about engaging in this partnership with us because she had had previous partnerships that just fell apart or were dead and just didn't work out. And so was initially very worried that we were just gonna be another thing that showed up that was well-intended that never followed through. And over time, it changed. It went from, hey, we're doing a couple phone calls to, okay, we're gonna come in and do focus groups. We're gonna do play testing. And being able to work with them was great. And it was completely unique in that we started bringing our engineers to the hospital. And that allowed for both direct feedback from the patients in the hospital who were using it, as well as indirect feedback. Being able to see these people use it in the real life rather than a video, you could see how they were adjusting it. We were able to get indirect feedback as well. And we kept going back to the hospital. And then it ended up being great because gaming is actually an amazing tool for rehabilitation. So in here we have Corey, who is down in the lower left, who is gaming with his brother. And it's also a great opportunity for him to work on head control, which is great because the switch inputs that he'll use for gaming are the same kind he'll use for communication and on his wheelchair for steering. So we also have Jonah up here in the upper right, and he was transitioning from a power chair to a manual chair, and gaming for him is an opportunity to build trunk strength, arm strength, endurance. And we also have Ivar, who has a spinal cord injury, and he was transitioning from head and mouth inputs to hand inputs. And again, this is another instance in where they were able to use gaming to do this in a fun way, and we were able to learn from them while we were developing the Xbox Adaptive Controller. And honestly, the feedback that we were getting was some of the things that I absolutely loved about this entire process. Putting our prototypes in the hands of these players even made some small changes. So this is just a picture of the bottom of the Xbox Adaptive Controller. And although what the main focus is in the picture would be the mounts, because you can easily mount the adaptive controller on tripods or to wheelchairs, anything like that, the picture is actually because the bottom is black. Originally, the bottom of this was not black. And the reason we ended up making it black was we kept finding there were a lot of people who were putting like black sticky Velcro tape on the bottom so they could stick it to something else. And then, that made it look like less sexy, to have these black stripes on it. We're like, man, if people are gonna be doing this all the time, like, we wanna keep this like looking like a nice piece of technology because we don't want this to look like, some medical device that, they have to do all this extra work for. And so the whole reason the bottom was black was because it makes it look better when people attach other things to the bottom, because we wanted to keep it slick. Like, those are just like the types of changes that were being made in the product while we were going through that. And it ended up being incredibly powerful to see the controller being used and hooked up. So this is a picture of Jesse, and so he needed a pretty complex setup. So this is actually him in the Inclusive Tech Lab, and here we have Caitlin, who is an occupational therapist that works for us now, and she's using the quad stick controller, which is the puff and sip controller that's USB that she can then plug into the Xbox adaptive controller so that he can play games on Xbox. And when you kind of combined that sip and puff controller with remapping in Rocket League, he was able to jump and drive around. And so he actually would use putt for jump, and he would sit for boost. But one of the other things that we really learned from working with the community is frequently gamers were already using Copilot. So there were a few different examples of how they would do this. But one of the things that we were even seeing in Take Home is, so this is a picture by Cherry Ray. You should follow her on Twitter follow them on Twitter at Cherry Ray. And how she was playing is, she doesn't always need the adaptive controller, but what she struggles with are the triggers that I mentioned earlier, because they are the hardest buttons to use on the controller. And so she doesn't have any issues with the face buttons. The sticks she uses extenders for, that's pretty straightforward. But how she plays is actually using Copilot, and she'll put the controller on top of the Xbox adaptive controller, and now instead of using the triggers, she can use these two big buttons under her hands to be able to play. But the other way that we would see it is that we would have one player using the adaptive controller, and we would have another player who would be doing sort of the driving and steering. So in this video, this is Bran and Dan from All Access Life, and how they have this set up is the switches that you can see on the wheelchair are hooked up into the adaptive controller, and then he will be using the traditional controller to be able to play. So basically all of the shooting, all of the meleeing, that's all being done via the switches, and all is being done with the other controller steering. And so even more things were being unlocked by combining technologies we already had, which was super fun. It's also great because at the end of that particular video, there's some music playing, and they're jamming out to one of the emotes. But we're moving on. So that was just a part of us learning and taking this device and getting feedback. I can't stress how much of the journey of the Xbox adaptive controller was getting feedback from users and having their input. But like I said, it all really started from the Microsoft's example of inclusive design. So if you kind of think of how you apply that process to the adaptive controller, so starting with recognizing inclusion, our traditional game controller is optimized around a lot of assumptions, creating unintentional barriers. So learning from diversity, engaging the game accessibility community and the gaming and disability community to get insight on not only the functionality of the device, how they were using it, any other changes that we could make, even something as simple as you can see in this photo that as there are all these little plugs, directly above them there's a little indentation. And that's literally so that perhaps if you don't have a steady hand, if you get it in that groove, it'll help you get it plugged in. Everything's kind of clearly labeled, and again, this was all from watching people use it. And then, again, looking to solve for one, extend to many. So we looked at very unique cases of people using the device and seeing what they needed and trying to solve for it. So we needed to be able to solve for the gamer, for a caregiver, so someone who's going to be helping them set up this controller, who may not be a gamer at all. We need to make this so that they can understand it. And make sure it gets fit completely around them. But we didn't stop there. This is actually one of my favorite parts of the Xbox adaptive controller. We also realized that there was issue with packaging. So Scott is someone who worked on the Xbox Adaptive Controller as well, and he was doing an in-home visit with a customer who didn't have the complete use of his hands. And he offered Scott a Coke, and Scott went ahead and took it. And then this guy proceeded to open his own can of Coke with his teeth, which terrifies me. Which, you know, in some ways, opening a can of soda with your teeth is kind of badass, but from a design perspective, that is absolutely terrible. But it actually turned out what Scott saw was that he pretty much opened everything with his teeth. And that wasn't uncommon just because it could be so hard to open packaging. And that spurred one of the weirdest design principles that I've ever heard, and the same for Bryce, of no teeth packaging. Like, that was the goal. Like, you're gonna be able to open this package without using your teeth. And the packaging team really took that principle to heart, and it was a magnificent success. You basically, as you could see in the video, open this packaging with one hand, and very little strength needed to do so. And this completely rethought the entire process of designing something, and honestly, this is one of the benchmarks that we now have. Like, the adaptive controller is one of the first, I think the first, that literally had the inclusive design process from ideation all the way to literally the packaging. And obviously, once it's done and once it gets on shelves, that's when you launch it. This is a series of photos of me ugly crying, because I can't stress how much this controller meant to the gaming and disability community. So I stream on Wednesdays, and the embargo that was lifting for the Xbox Adaptive Controller actually lifted during one of my live streams, and I knew it, and I was ready. And I kept telling everyone, like, be in my stream tonight around 10 p.m. for no reason, just nothing's happening at 10, but at 10, maybe you should think about coming over. And then, like, as soon as the clock ticked over, I'm like, here it is, oh my God, re-announced, showing the trailer. And I was trying to keep it cool. Like, I had joked that I was gonna ugly cry for a long time, and I didn't think I actually would. But then I went over to Cherry's live stream from the photo earlier, and then Cherry started crying on her stream. And then when I saw Cherry started to cry, I started to cry, and then I got progressively uglier as I kept crying. Like, that's how much it meant to the community that something like this was built. And again, the love and care that went into the product, because we worked with people with disabilities to get their feedback and their needs, it made such a difference. And now that it's out in the wild, we get a lot of questions. We get a lot more questions about accessibility, which is great. And to quote Ian over here, the Xbox Adaptive Controller means it's more need for accessibility rather than less, as it means more gamers with a broader range of abilities will be on the platform. So because of things like the Xbox Adaptive Controller, more gamers with disabilities will be able to game. And that kind of ties into the next question that I get a lot. So how do you make your game work with Zach? The answer is you don't. Zach is a normal controller. That is all it is. So if you want to empower gamers, you need to not rely on them to use the Zach. The Zach is getting them into the game. You still have to make accessible technologies. And you don't have to trust me. You can literally trust Bryce. Here he is with his baby. Even though we offer at the console level the ability to do this remapping, it's very important we continue to ask game developers to insert remapping into their games. The Xbox Adaptive Controller can allow gamers to set up their own custom setups, but if you're relying on the Xbox Adaptive Controller and the console level remapping for these gamers to be able to game, you're putting a whole separate stack of issues on top of them. The first being additional cognitive load, because when we remap on the system level, we're not talking to your game at all. Your game's UI prompts won't change. And so if you're going through a tutorial that says A to jump and they've remapped A, they're gonna have to remember every time they see that prompt, they're not actually hitting A. They're hitting whatever they've mapped it to. So this is a really common misconception that we've seen since the Xbox Adaptive Controller has been launched. And so I wanna go ahead and just say, no, still put remapping in your games. Again, the Xbox Adaptive Controller is getting people into gaming. We still need accessible games, and we need them even more now because more people can game. And that's really all I have. So I wanted to keep up here. Bryce Johnson, the inclusive delete of Microsoft devices, and Aaron, who's the occupational therapist from Craig Hospital. Please give them a follow, because they, like I said, I joined the journey really late. I was part of the team that was helping find take-home participants and giving feedback, but these guys were around from the beginning. And of course, you can follow me, but fair warning, a lot of it is really stupid shit. But I have been live tweeting some events, so we have that. And so I actually went through this stuff pretty quick because I wanted to be able to answer a decent chunk of question for you guys. So we do have a microphone, and it's important you speak into the microphone when asking a question, so it's recorded. So, and with that, I'm ready to take questions. Oh, I also forgot. I have pins. So after the talk, if you would like a pin, please come up and you can have a game accessibility pin.
All right. How much, if any, of the technology or the tech, let's say, that you share with other companies? Like, are you speaking to Nintendo, Sony, or anyone about this? Because it's great that Microsoft has it, but what about the rest?
What can I say here? So Phil Spencer has already publicly said that we would love for the Xbox adaptive controller to be on every platform. At Xbox and even Microsoft, not just Xbox, we are a firm believer of a rising tide floats all boats. And so we don't want to hoard our accessibility technology, as it were. We will share everything, because if we've already found a solution that we think works, if we can give it to you and you can make it better, and then we can learn from you, we will. In terms of exact conversations, I don't have info on that, but we've already said publicly, we are fine with putting this anywhere that will take it.
Hi, this is Brandon Zahan. I also work at Microsoft. I just wanted to follow up to add to what Tara said. The device itself reports out as a joystick, as a gamepad. If you plug this into any platform, it reports out as a gamepad. So, this works on Windows, it works on Xbox. It'll actually, we've seen it working on newer Android devices. Anything that I think it's anything that understands USB, Bluetooth, joystick hit. So, to Tara's point, we want other platforms to support this. In fact, I believe Google Stadia has announced that they're going to be supporting it. So, absolutely, we are not restricting this in any way, shape, or form. We want other platforms to make use of it, and we'd love to see Nintendo or Sony come along and use it if they want to.
Hello. Just want to add to this because we use it also for the Oculus Quest as well. So we actually make it work in VR. So that's quite nice that it works also with that platform. And I think that's not covered yet, but I think it's also important to mention that for new technologies like for Oculus Quest, it's really, really helpful to use as well. And I'm not sure if you have seen it or have done anything in combination with virtual reality on that part.
I haven't seen anyone use it in VR yet, but I'm going to be honest, I tend to stay away from VR because I get super motion sick super easily, so I just kind of stay away from anything VR related. And it's really awkward because if people are playing VR games, I'll just leave because I don't want to have to explain to everyone how I'm going to vomit. So I haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean that someone isn't already doing it.
Okay, thanks.
Hi Tara, thanks so much for giving that talk. I just have a question out of curiosity. I take your point, what you said about mapping, but I'm wondering if there's any genres or particular games that users have found more accessible?
So it's a complex question with a complex answer. So the short version is there's not any particular genre of game that would be more or less accessible than other genres, because the diverse spectrum of needs of gamers, you may find certain type of games are better suited for certain types of players, but would cause a challenge for different types of players. So you even see, things that would make a game more accessible to someone who is deaf or hard of hearing would not necessarily help someone who is low or no vision. And so when you kind of think of the controller in the same way, it will get people into games, but depending on their exact type of needs, it really changes, what works best for them. There are games that are have certain options that make it easier for it to become accessible, like games that have a lot of options on remapping, sensitivity, southpaw, toggle versus hold options, autofill options. So it's not necessarily the game genre being more or less accessible, it's like a set of game options that will make any game more or less accessible. So you kind of find that a lot of gamers will gravitate towards the games that have the options they need, sometimes regardless of what the genre is. Got any? I left a lot of time for other questions. You can. Oh, there we go.
Hello. Has the development of the adaptive controller affected the design, either currently or upcoming, on the classic controller, on the existing Xbox controller? Has it made it, for the future of it, to be more accessible, or actually just as or less accessible because there's now the adaptive controller there?
So what's interesting about the adaptive controller is it's basically an Elite controller. It's fully powered by the same technology. So as we go forward and work on the Elite controller and its functionality and sort of how it's running, we get to remember that anything we add or change in the Elite controller could potentially open up further options for the Xbox adaptive controller down the line. And one of the things that you see with the Elite version 2 that recently came out, like now you can change the joysticks like really easily, and it comes with a bunch of different options, including the height, which is something that we see adjusted a lot. Even in the picture I showed with Cherry, she adds custom toppers onto hers to make it taller, but with like the Elite version 2, that's just now something you can buy with that controller, and it's kind of built in to make it customized. So it is a little bit cylindrical, and that, as we're working on specifically Elite, again, because they have the same core powering them, we're able to learn it like cylindrically while working on them both.
Hi. Although you've obviously put loads of research into it, have there been any surprises now it's been out in the wild, like from user feedback, that you didn't account for?
So I think because of take-home testing, we haven't seen anything that's really shocked us. I think during take-home testing, there were definitely things that we learned with how people were using it in terms of like, oh, we need to make sure that it's not going to slide off this table, or oh, we need to make sure that it's easy to clean. We need to like do all of those things. Honestly, the thing that I've been most shocked with was I anticipated more sort of pro esport players picking this up. Like there was a lot of talk of just like, imagine, so you're playing Halo and you have to move your thumb to reload. Well, what if I had a foot pedal where I could reload instead? And so I really thought that we would see that picked up. And so for me, the biggest surprise has been it's penetrated the non-disability market not as much as I thought, because I really thought pro players would take this as a way to reduce their hand movements on their controllers to make them faster. But we haven't seen that yet, and I don't know why. But that's been the biggest surprise for me. Like I was convinced it was gonna happen, I just haven't seen it yet. Brandon's back there chuckling. Like he knows that I was there, and I was just like, there's gonna be pro players that are gonna do this, I know it. The other thing I thought would happen, which I've also not seen, is I used to play fighting games a lot, and I was just like, oh man, imagine like if you're someone who doesn't know how to solder and you want to build a custom arcade stick. Like this is totally a way you could build a custom arcade stick because you don't need to know how to solder, because you can just plug all the inputs in and put that in a case. And I also haven't seen anyone do that yet, and I was also convinced that was going to happen. So I'm just batting 1,000, completely wrong on everything.
Actually, I But I actually wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that and ask about the custom controllers and custom devices, because you brought up all these peripherals here, but can you talk a little bit about custom switch building with the Xbox Adaptive Controller in particular? How maybe talk a little bit about the ease at which people can build their own switches.
Oh, yes. So you would actually be surprised how expensive even just, particularly if you're buying them from like a medical player, how expensive even just simple switches like these can be. Like they can be like $50, which seems absurd for a piece of plastic, but there just aren't a lot of people making them, and so they can charge a lot, I guess. But you'll find that a lot of people need different needs. Even in the videos that we've shown here, you've seen that some people are using head switches, some people are using elbow switches, some people are using forearm. Some people need something really small, some people need something really large. And what's actually great about technology that's available today is you can even just like 3D print buttons that are custom to the side that you need, because we're using the same like standard 3mm jacks that all the switches are built out of, right? And so if you want to make something custom because you're going to use it in a way that we didn't see tested, you're able to build that and use that. I mean, Brandon, I know that you've 3D printed or made your own switches, so I don't know if you have anything else you want to add there.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really cool to see in the occupational therapy sector people building, essentially because you use a 3.5mm jack, we've been seeing people taking headphones and stripping off the earbuds and then using the wires and connecting them to everything from little like paper clips to, we saw somebody use a teddy bear and they put one wire in the front of the teddy bear and one in the back and put a little bit of conductive material in the middle so that when you squeeze the teddy bear, it made a switch. And they were using it for therapy to get a child to do stomach, basically core strengthening exercises. And so with Copilot, the therapist would navigate through the game, and when the child needed to jump, they'd hug the teddy bear, which was cute. But yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting to see people building their own custom switches to that point. So just wanted to call that out as something that if people are interested in the room and are happen to be a little bit nerdy, I mean, to print I was able to build a switch in less than 10 minutes with a pair of headphones and a cheap off-the-shelf button. Cost me about $5.
Yes, I've seen some people building fun things as well in like hackerspace kind of stuff, people using it to make like a tank controller. I saw a guy making like a giant 6-foot tall joystick that you stand on and like hug and lean around to control it. So it's a really nice way into doing just, even outside the accessibility space, just a nice way to easily hack your own input devices. And that's something that I'm personally excited about, is the potential of that in schools, in education, in universities. So there's already a lot of people doing making type stuff. The students can now just jump straight in and build their own devices directly from Xbox. That's pretty cool. But I did have actually something else. Bryce, his Twitter account there, if anyone wants to do any hacking about, he can give you the full specification of how to build things, not just the single inputs, but also for the analog stuff as well. I did have a question though, which was, how did it feel seeing Cher and T-Pain tweeting about it?
That was absurd. I never in my life thought that Cher or T-Pain would ever be tweeting about an accessible controller, but they were. That was completely ridiculous. And then it was the same year that Kim Kardashian also tweeted about it. It's a big year in game accessibility, I guess. All of the celebrities that you would not think would tweet about game accessibility were really into it last year. But T-Pain was especially ridiculous for me, because I once snuck into a T-Pain concert, and so it was very personal. No, he's not following me. Oh, shut up, Ian. No one likes you. That's a lie. Everyone loves Ian. Stupid. Oh, that is time. Okay. So remember, I do have some pins. Feel free to ask me any follow-up questions on Twitter, and there will be a roundtable discussion later today if you want to talk more. That's at 2 in a room somewhere. I have it. Room 7 at 2 o'clock if you're interested in the roundtable. All right, thanks, guys.